When looking back across the vast library of games released for the original PlayStation, which games come to mind first? Tomb Raider? Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Metal Gear Solid, perhaps?
All great choices to be sure, but amidst these lies another, the beginning of a series which helped one Bay Area developer rise up to become a juggernaut in the modern space. Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver.
A game which once captured the imagination of hundreds of thousands of gamers, but has remained dormant for years. Much like the struggle between the game's protagonists, Raziel and Kain, the story behind the creation of Soul Reaver is one fraught with conflict, but in the darkest hours, light awaits at the end of the tunnel.
Today we're going to be exploring the world of Soul Reaver, from its lengthy development and its technical achievements to its inevitable release across 3 different platforms, along with mountains of cut content. It's all here. We even have a special guest joining us for the very first time. So prepare yourself for a journey into the dark side as we jump into Soul Reaver. The story begins in the early 90s with a fated partnership between 2 companies, Crystal Dynamics and Silicon Knights.
Known today primarily for its work on Tomb Raider, Crystal Dynamics was founded back in 1992 and started creating games as the very first licensed developer for the brand new 3DO interactive multiplayer. Its very first game was Crash and Burn, a launch title and pack-in for the system which presented sprawling 3D tracks and a heaping dose of 90s tude.
Let's give them a war!
This was followed by a large number of releases, including Total Eclipse, a 3D space shooter designed to showcase the capabilities of the system, Gex, a 2D platformer featuring a talking gecko voiced by Dana Gould that served as a sort of mascot for the company, as well as a port of the Neo Geo fighting game, Samurai Showdown. While some of these games suffer from technical shortcomings tied to how 3DO works with 2D graphics, Gex and Samurai Showdown, for instance, both run at 30 frames per second with slowdown, which is uncommon for the genre, Crystal Dynamics showed plenty of promise, and released a huge amount of titles. Within a 3-year window, Crystal Dynamics would develop more than 11 games while publishing several other games created by various other developers. It was this publishing division that led to the partnership with Silicon Knights. Silicon Knights got its start creating strategy action games primarily for SSI. Its final SSI project was Dark Legions, which was wrapping up when its founder, Dennis Dyack, first met Lyle Hall, a producer at Crystal that was working on Gex.
The two shared a passion for large budget games with a focus on storytelling, and inevitably, this led to Dennis pitching 3 ideas to various publishers, including Crystal Dynamics.
This included the Two Human concept, which would linger for decades before appearing on Xbox 360, a dark fantasy title, going by the title The Pillars of Nosgoth, and an unknown third concept. Lyle was taken by the Pillars concept though. A dark vampiric take on The Legend of Zelda was just the ticket, and thus a production deal was made with Silicon Knights. The 3DO was obviously the first choice here, but its poor sales performance did ultimately lead to developing for the Sony PlayStation instead. For the next 3 years, Silicon Knights, Crystal Dynamics, and a third publishing partner, Activision, would toil away on what would become Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. While the game was primarily developed by Silicon Knights in-house, the team did receive aid from Crystal Dynamics in the form of employees that worked alongside the Blood Omen team to help bring it to market. One of those key figures was none other than Amy Hennig, who you might recognize from the Uncharted games. She would become a central figure in the series going forth. The game was finally completed in 1996 and was released to critical and commercial acclaim, at least by the standards of the day. It suffered from numerous technical problems, such as the inability to play digitized speech and music simultaneously, but it was a solid effort nonetheless, and one that would warrant a sequel. Unfortunately, the path forward was anything but clear.
And to take us through the next section then, I've invited a special guest to join us here today for the first time. Mama Robotnik he goes by, and he's a poster of gaming research across the internet with a focus on the cut and the cancelled, an occasional Kotaku contributor, and a longtime fan and advocate of the Legacy of Kain series.
The journey to Soul Reaver is as fascinating as it is convoluted, with 3 separate precursor projects leading to its development. The financial and critical success of Blood Omen Legacy of Kain led to demand for a sequel, but who would make it? 3 parties had contributed to the first game, Activision as publisher and Crystal Dynamics and Silicon Knights as developers. The relationship between the latter 2 companies had significantly declined towards the end of Blood Omen's development. Comments since made by a former staffer disclosed that the police had to be called in on one occasion to resolve tensions, and legal documents published at a later date expanded on a number of slights and accusations made by each of the 2 companies. There appeared to be no reconciliation, so Activision was forced to pick a side. They first approached Crystal Dynamics and requested concepts and an outline for a sequel, provisionally titled Kain 2. As alleged in the court hearing Silicon Knights v Crystal Dynamics, work was carried out but was not up to the expectations of the publisher. Activision then approached Silicon Knights and asked for their own vision of Kain 2. So for a while at least, the 2 separate companies were both conceptualising their own sequels to Blood Omen. Hints have been made by Silicon Knights over the years as to the contents of their own proposed continuation, a prequel to the original game, telling the backstory of the popular Blood Omen character Vorador. At this point, things become somewhat hazy, and both the parallel Kain 2 projects are discontinued. Eidos Interactive purchased Crystal Dynamics, and at some point asserted that they had the rights to produce a Legacy of Kain sequel. They then tried to find a way to leverage the IP and spotted an opportunity. Amy Hennig, now famous for the Uncharted games and various other projects, had begun to lead a team at Crystal Dynamics in the creation of a new 3D action-adventure property codenamed Shifter. The premise was of a game filled with angelic and biblical allusions in which an entity, the titular Shifter, returned from oblivion to hunt down his brethren and former master. The creature would shift between the realms of the living and the dead in order to progress in his quest for vengeance. Eidos requested that Hennig and her team transplant their concept into the Legacy of Kain universe, with the Master becoming Kain and the Shifter becoming Raziel. This seemed to be an easy choice for Eidos, as Hennig had worked on the original Blood Omen. Silicon Knights challenged the game's development, and some form of settlement was agreed, the terms of which have been rarely spoken about by either party. The conclusion was that Eidos Interactive became recognised by Silicon Knights as the owner of the Legacy of Kain IP, and Soul Reaver was finally able to move into full development.
Eventually, the public would get a first look at the game in the form of a demo. The Soul Reaver Lighthouse demo was released on a number of different demo discs, including one bundled with another Crystal game, Akuji the Heartless. The demo showcases the game in an early state, giving players a taste of what was to come.
And of course, the demo itself was extremely limited and could be completed within 2 or 3 minutes if you were fast enough. It showcases the combat in a very early state, and the controls in general feel extremely twitchy. The visuals also lack the refinement we would come to find in the final game, and when you finish the demo, note the release date here on the screen. This original release date came and went, and ultimately Soul Reaver spent more than 2.5 years in development. The team encountered and overcame a huge number of challenges, many of which had never before been attempted on the system, which ultimately led to the game being finished for release on August 16, 1999. Soul Reaver was released into a difficult climate. The Dreamcast was around the corner in the West, and The Legend of Zelda had redefined expectations of what an action-adventure could be. Despite this, Soul Reaver managed to leave its mark as one of the most technically accomplished releases the PlayStation would ever see. With vast worlds to explore, fluid animation, and incredible audio production, it still stands out to this day.
Its basic structure follows the formula often known as Metroidvania, with a focus on obtaining abilities to unlock new routes through previously explored areas. It is a brilliant romp rich in storytelling and lore, and its sprawling worlds were unlike anything PlayStation gamers had experienced before. It was a smashing success all around, and it couldn't have been done without the technology powering the game. That technology platform is known as the Gex engine, named after Crystal's original mascot character, and it pushed the PlayStation to its limits.
Starting with the basics then, Soul Reaver runs in a higher resolution than your average PlayStation title, 512 by 240. It also targets 30 frames per second, though a slowdown does occur as we'll see later. In comparison, Ocarina of Time on the Nintendo 64 runs at just 320 by 240 at 20 frames per second, Soul Reaver manages to increase both frame rate and resolution to great effect. And the N64 comparison is rather apt, as Crystal Dynamics sought to conquer one of the system's greatest limitations: loading. The PlayStation used CD-ROMs, which offer copious amounts of space, and the option to push audio and video to the next level. Unfortunately, with just a double-speed drive installed, the system is limited by data transfer speeds. The result? In most games, loading screens were a harsh reality, unfortunately. The original Blood Omen, which was just a 2D game even, is perhaps one of the worst offenders. This would not stand for the sequel. In comparison, on Nintendo 64, games were regularly shipping with large, seamless worlds devoid of loading screens, and that's precisely what Crystal Dynamics wanted to deliver with its new game. Soul Reaver then stands as one of the first examples of real-time data streaming used to conceal loading. As a result, the game is virtually seamless, with only a single short loading screen appearing when you first start the game. So how does it work? Essentially, the game is broken down into a series of units, with each unit representing a room, hallway, or path to other rooms. Once the game is up and running, Soul Reaver stores 3 of these units in memory at any point: the room the player is standing in, and the 2 adjacent units. As players move into a new unit, the one furthest from the player that resides in memory will be cleared and a new one loaded. Maps are designed so that loading a new unit into memory requires less time than it takes for the player to cross the current unit. Clever, right? This could still require a lot of data to be loaded, however, so additional tricks are used to improve data throughput. For one thing, each map unit has a list of object types used in a scene. Each object is loaded just one time, and the list informs the system how many copies should be placed within a certain area. This is extended to model and environment data as well, which have a list at the start of each file that the game can loop through, storing references along the way. Essentially, it becomes possible to quickly look up skin, animation, or polygon data from any model using these pointers. Another memory-saving technique lies in the use of color lookup tables. All textures use these palettes to define an appropriate color, and different parts of a texture can be used to look up different tables, enabling richer color schemes. Per vertex coloring is also used to bring further variety to the world. This allows the developer to utilize a single texture in a variety of different situations with varying results. The texture data is smaller, and you only need to store a single texture type rather than variations on a single texture. On top of this, due to ample storage space on the disc, file duplicates are placed all over the CD, enabling faster access to specific assets when needed. These days with hard drives it's less critical, but there was a time when data placement on a disc could have a huge impact on retrieval speed. All of these elements come together to allow for a fully functional data streaming system on the original PlayStation. It was truly possible to run from one end of the world to another without seeing a single loading screen. Prior to Soul Reaver, this was simply unheard of on a disc-based console. But Crystal Dynamics wasn't content with just delivering a seamless world. The design also called for dimensional shifting. During gameplay, players could jump between the spectral and material planes. This plays a key role in puzzle solving and storytelling alike, so it was critical to get right. Loading 2 different versions of a single map unit would have required loading, of course, so that goes against what the team was trying to achieve. In the end, the solution they settled on was far more efficient and streamlined. Each map has a material and spectral variant, but ultimately share the same basic map data. What happens when you shift from one to the other, though, is an adjustment of the underlying geometry. Essentially, map vertices are mapped to different coordinates in each iteration of the map, and while changing planes, the game simply interpolates between the two. Vertex color data is also modified to enhance the illusion. Ultimately, these elements come together to allow the Gex engine to deliver a fully functional data streaming system on the original PlayStation, while simultaneously being able to shift between 2 map states. The work poured into this powerful engine would continue to serve Crystal well after the release of this game.
As an interesting aside, Soul Reaver was developed using SN Systems' SciQ development tools, a very common set of tools at the time. SN Systems had created tools for developing games on a variety of platforms, and Psygnosis published these products. When Sony acquired Psygnosis, then a meeting was arranged between Sony and SN Systems to showcase its tools. Sony was impressed enough to move forward with SN Systems' product, and 10 years later in 2005, Sony would even go so far as to acquire SN Systems for future tools development. While SciQ was relatively common on the PlayStation, it's interesting that these libraries were used on the PC and likely even Dreamcast versions of the game, which was not that common.
Another aspect worth discussing here is the audio. The soundtrack plays a huge role in creating the atmosphere throughout the game. The unique soundscape was crafted by the very talented musician Kurt Harland. Kurt had previously worked on older titles for the Mega Drive before contributing to Gex Enter the Gecko on the original PlayStation. Of course, Kurt's career started well before video games as a member of the synth-pop band Information Society, which was formed back in 1982. In 1997 then, the group released an album entitled Don't Be Afraid. On the album was a track entitled Ozar Mirashim 1.1. Sound familiar? This was the song that helped Kurt land the job as a composer for the series after team member Mark Miller played it for the rest of the team. It is this song that helped define the game's audio signature, one that the series would become known for, and a sound unlike any other game on the market. And most of it was not even pre-recorded, save for the introduction movie. While the CD-ROM format is often credited for allowing the PlayStation to produce high-quality music, the reality is that many games don't actually use the extra space for music and instead rely on sequenced audio similar to the Super NES. This was the case with Soul Reaver, which relied heavily on sequenced audio tracks that could be dynamically altered and shifted based on what was happening on screen. The sound quality is superb, yet the storage and memory footprint was absolutely tiny. It's difficult to imagine Soul Reaver without its dynamic music system and awesome atmospheric tracks. Thus far then, we've examined the various ways in which the PlayStation hardware was pushed with Soul Reaver, but of course, we cannot ignore its flaws. As usual, affine texture warping was a huge problem for the hardware, with obvious bending and distortion visible in many surfaces. Due to already tight memory restrictions, Soul Reaver does not appear to make great use of geometry subdivision as we saw in Quake 2 on the PlayStation 1. This can help alleviate some of these problems, but thankfully the geometry is still dense enough that the game manages to feel reasonably solid all around, but as you explore, you'll definitely notice the texture warping, no doubt about it. Then there's the performance. While the game targets 30 frames per second, that objective is not always met, and we often see performance more like this, with significant drops in larger areas or with scenes featuring lots of enemies. Now, of course, today this seems pretty bad, but you have to consider the time of release. As mentioned earlier, Zelda was 20 frames per second at max, and most other similar open adventure games, even on N64, also ran with severe frame rate problems, often dropping well into the teens. Compared to those games, Soul Reaver manages to hold up fairly well. Even with the lower levels of performance then, the original PS1 release does at least still offer the best controller options, with support for the DualShock enabling proper analog movement, and the 4 shoulder buttons making it easy to adjust the camera while moving through the world. It's a lot to take in when looking back over the entirety of the game, no doubt, but the PlayStation version was just the beginning. The first port to arrive following the original PS1 release then was the PC version. This is more or less a direct port of the PlayStation original, with a number of PS1 specific optimizations adapted to work better on the PC platform. It supports higher resolutions and color depth, it offers texture filtering, and it can run at a more consistent frame rate. At its core, the assets used here are very much the same as the original game. The meshes are all identical, while the frame rate is limited to a maximum of 30 frames per second, much like Tomb Raider. Texture maps were derived from the original as well, but stored in a different format this time. PlayStation relies heavily on palletized texture maps, but on the PC this technique isn't supported by all graphics cards, so textures are stored with necessary color data included in the textures themselves. This requires additional textures to be stored, which increases the memory and storage footprint. It was a decent port for its day, but ultimately falls short of what could have been. For one thing, the controls do not appear to support any form of modern analog sticks, resulting in movement that feels somewhat less fluid. Secondly, the dynamic music system from the PlayStation version is lost on the PC, with the game instead relying on pre-recorded audio tracks. These tracks fade in and out when they reach the end, and fail to change based on the action around you. It is a noticeable step back to say the least. The version being sold on sites such as GOG.com have also been slightly enhanced with things like Bink movie support, as opposed to using the original AR movie format used by older Eidos titles. Another interesting advantage is the ability to modify the game. In particular, the debug menu contained in an early version of the PS1 title has been modded into the PC version. This allows you to change everything from Raziel's powers to visiting any level in the game, or just changing between the spectral and material planes at will. Something that was originally planned but ultimately removed from the game. There isn't really a whole lot more to say about the PC version though. It's precisely what you would have expected at the time, but not a lot more. No, the port I really want to talk about is the Dreamcast conversion. Soul Reaver would arrive on the Dreamcast in January 2000, less than 6 months after the PS1 version. The Dreamcast iteration of Soul Reaver offers noticeable improvements over the PlayStation and PC version overall, with just a couple of drawbacks of its own. First and foremost, the Dreamcast version is bumped up to 640x480 resolution, targeting 60 frames per second. Right away, the game looks and feels better than the PC or PlayStation versions with fast, responsive gameplay. The dithering of the PS1 has been eliminated, the frame rate is higher, and the visuals appear more detailed. Furthermore, in some of the more open scenes, we actually see the fog distance pushed further back on Dreamcast, enabling players to see further into the distance. Though unfortunately, doing so does seem to cause some performance issues on the Dreamcast as well. And thanks to tools like Model EX, we can see precisely what has changed between the original and Dreamcast release. Main character models all receive a significant increase in polygon counts. Raziel on Dreamcast is more detailed and rounded than the original model used on PS1 and PC, for instance. And in terms of file size, Raziel is the largest individual piece of model data on the disc. The same is true of Kain, who now more closely resembles Kain as he would appear in future games as opposed to the PS1 original. Both texture and geometry detail is improved here, and it looks great. While we're discussing character models then, here's a fun fact. The game uses the same model format as Final Fantasy VII's battle sequences. Neat, huh? Unfortunately, there was no way the development team would have had enough time to apply this level of polish to the entirety of the game, so most of the lesser models are basically identical to the original release. The same is true of the environment. The map meshes are identical between all 3 versions of Soul Reaver. There is no boost to complexity or detail here on the Dreamcast. That doesn't mean they don't look nicer. The elimination of affine texture warping certainly helps the world appear more solid on Dreamcast than it does on PlayStation. And like PlayStation, Dreamcast uses color lookup tables to determine texture color, though many of the textures are stored with color information already included. Unfortunately, this highlights a weakness. The Dreamcast version uses VQ texture compression, which was standard for the system, and this results in slightly lower quality textures overall. Observe. Here's a PC texture coming in at 91 kilobytes in its extracted size. The Dreamcast texture then is 51 kilobytes. The difference is subtle, but you can see extra compression artifacts visible on the Dreamcast side. And how about this? A block of 64x64 textures used in the game. If we look at this block, you can see that there is additional detail loss on Dreamcast compared to the PC. Now, some textures were actually improved, like Raziel's character textures, but in general, environment textures appear slightly muddier on Dreamcast due to the extra compression. Keep in mind that PC includes all color data in its textures, so the texture file actually comes in at 160 megabytes. On Dreamcast then, it's just 25 megabytes in comparison. PlayStation does not store textures in this way, however, and instead buries assets within a single file alongside model data. The Dreamcast does, however, use 16-bit floating point values for its texture coordinates, as opposed to 8-bit integers that we see on PlayStation. Still, while playing, the game looks decidedly superior on the Dreamcast overall, though in retrospect, the option to disable texture filtering would have been welcome since these 64x64 textures hold up better without it. So how about the actual frame rate then? The bump to 60 frames per second was a big deal since the PC version does not offer this option. Fortunately, in most cases, the game manages to hold pretty steady and feels great to play. But when entering larger areas, it does tend to exhibit noticeable slowdown. It feels rather jarring and does tend to interfere with control since the frame rate is basically sliced in half. Unfortunately, I noticed that there's a general sense of instability throughout most of the game. Just running down the hallway and past various enemies, you're going to get these little pockets of slowdown that pop up as you play. This likely comes down to the fact that the game uses a double buffer VSync solution, so when it does drop frames, it drops pretty hard and you definitely feel it. Also, certain effects are limited to updating every other frame. The snow here, for instance, is displayed at half rate or 30 frames per second, a side effect of the original code, no doubt. The other issue with the Dreamcast port is the controls. With just 2 triggers, that leaves camera rotation to the D-pad. Simply put, you cannot move and control the camera simultaneously without moving your right hand. It doesn't feel great. Still, despite these shortcomings, the Dreamcast version remains perhaps the best way to experience Soul Reaver today. You get the fastest frame rate and the most attractive visuals.
While we're not delving into the sequel, Soul Reaver 2, it was originally in development for the Dreamcast. It's likely that the original Soul Reaver we're looking at here today was ported as an exercise in getting up to speed with the system for its sequel. Unfortunately, only a few shots exist and no playable code was ever leaked, so we don't really know much about it. So that's all 3 official versions of the game, but we cannot discuss Soul Reaver without delving into cut content. Yes, the game that we received was ultimately incomplete, and Mama Robotnik joins us once more to share his extensive knowledge on the subject.
When the words "to be continued" appeared at the end of Soul Reaver, players were caught completely off guard. The story had been in full flow, and a sudden final battle with Kain had felt more like a mid-game boss. Something didn't add up. Gamers took to the internet and compared their experiences. Some pointed out pathways in the game world that just seemed to be tantalisingly out of reach. Others noted the number of dead ends in the map design, with highly intricate areas leading to abrupt walls. As the fans delved deeper, they uncovered magazine previews which showed areas, abilities and story developments, none of which that had come to pass in the actual game. Raziel could be seen exploring unknown regions, fighting unrecognised adversaries with an unfamiliar array of fantastical powers. With no comment from the developers forthcoming, it was the website of the Gaming Intelligence Agency that made the breakthrough that linked all of these observations together. They used an extraction tool on the PlayStation disc to access audio files from the game, and found dialogue that told a story that never took place. For the first time, the fans heard fragments of the true, intended story of Soul Reaver. The fans continued this research in the years that have followed, and now the original scope of the game is more or less completely understood. While the released game was incredibly impressive, especially so considering its PlayStation origins, Crystal Dynamics' original designs for the title had been tremendously more ambitious. The game was severely curtailed in mid-development for 2 reasons. The first was publisher deadlines, which in itself is not an unusual occurrence in the industry. The second reason though was much more technical. Some of the later level designs proved to be impossible to realise on the humble PlayStation. Geometry, distance issues, and flickering became apparent, and lacking the time to entirely redesign these environments, entire areas were chopped from the game. The cut areas contained numerous character upgrades, weapon enhancements, vital story developments, and a sequence of escalating boss battles that led to a very different grand finale than the one that was in the retail release. The environments that remained in the game had to be hastily overhauled to render inaccessible pathways that relied on the cut power-ups, thus explaining the dead ends that terminated numerous paths. So, with all this in mind, what did we miss out on? At the end of the released version of Soul Reaver, spoiler alert, a furious Raziel tracks Kain to an ancient subterranean time machine where, following a heated conversation about their predestined existences and a short boss battle, the two flee their doomed world and into the past. To be continued. End credits. What was meant to happen before the cuts was that the derelict time machine did not function, allowing Raziel to temporarily corner Kain and reave a portion of his soul. This granted him a character upgrade, the ability to shift at will between the spectral and material realms. In the released game, this feat was only possible via cheat codes. Kain, injured but defiant, would have retreated to a distant fortress, and Raziel would have continued his explorations of Nosgoth. He would have gone on to uncover the chasms of the Undercity, the ornate temple of the vampire-worshipping priestess, the lava-filled territory of Raziel's lost brother Terrell, and the gigantic smokestack of Nosgoth's northern mountains, a structure seen in the opening full-motion video belching smoke into the sky. By overcoming the bosses in these areas and consuming their souls, Raziel would have become further enhanced with new powers. Soul possession, which allowed him to take control of the bodies of his enemies, and enhanced telekinesis, which allowed the destruction of heavy obstacles. These abilities opened up yet more areas in the game world, the previously mentioned dead ends, to reveal several forges that enhanced the Soul Reaver weapon itself. In the retail release, a lone Fire Reaver enhancement was found, but this was intended to be one of many elemental upgrades. So let's take all of that in for a second. The enormity of storyline, environments, bosses and power-ups that had to be excised. One cannot help but admire Crystal Dynamics for the scale of their ambitions, and consider that it must have been heartbreaking for them to have reduced their vision of the game so dramatically due to business and technical constraints. Given this context, it's remarkable that the final release of Soul Reaver, as cut as heavily as it is an absolutely spectacular, substantial game. It's a testament to developer pragmatism that they were able to respond to the hand that they were dealt, and nonetheless give gamers an astonishing title. One last thing we should note, the sequels to Soul Reaver would go on to use some of this cut content, but in dramatically different story contexts. The plot of Raziel's quest to kill Kain was completely sidelined to make way for a much deeper, more complex relationship between the two characters. As Kain would go on to say to Raziel at the beginning of Soul Reaver 2, in an oblique reference to the abandoned intended storyline of the first game, "I have seen the beginning and the end of our story, and the tale is crude and ill-conceived. We must rewrite the ending of it."
Soul Reaver is now 18 years old and remains great even to this day, but what is the best way to enjoy it today? Unfortunately, there's no great answer, but I have some suggestions. Firstly, if you have original hardware, that's certainly one way to do it, especially if you're using the Dreamcast. If you don't have a console though, the PC version is available from GOG and works without issue, but it's capped at 30 frames per second and does not work especially well with gamepads of today. That leaves emulation, and the best version to emulate is going to be the Dreamcast version. And the best emulator to use is still Demule, but even then, Soul Reaver is not emulated 100% perfectly. The life bar in the HUD, for instance, is displayed improperly, though it does at least function as you'd expect. There's also plenty of additional microstutters observable during gameplay that detract ever so slightly from the experience. Thankfully, it makes up for this in other areas. The severe slowdown evident on a real Dreamcast console is almost completely eliminated, allowing you to traverse previously sluggish areas at a full 60 frames per second. It certainly feels a lot better in this regard. Secondly, the PC also allows you to customize your controls, which means it's possible to work around the Dreamcast's configuration limitations. Want to use the shoulder buttons or the right analog stick perhaps to move the camera? It's possible when using emulation. As for the resolution, well, I prefer to use the latest DirectX 11 plugin, which provides the best accuracy at the expense of an internal resolution selector. As you can see here, the visuals being displayed are still just 640 by 480, upscaled using nearest neighbor to avoid softening the edges. Of course, if you prefer a higher resolution image, you can use the older DX11 plugin with Demule, which does allow you to massively increase the internal resolution of the game. This is sort of a matter of taste though, as I kinda think that this game looks better at a lower resolution since it helps conceal some of the flaws, but if you're someone that prefers a nice clean, sharp, high resolution image, even with lower quality visuals, it's not a bad way to play. Another option, of course, is null DC, which does manage to correct the life bar glitch that we observed in Damule. Unfortunately, transparency effects like this barrier here are broken on null DC and look significantly worse than a real Dreamcast or Damule, so you kinda have to pick your poison here. Of course, if you still have the PlayStation 1 version, you can emulate that one as well, or just play on a regular PlayStation, and as mentioned before, the PC version is also an option as it's pretty easy to set up. If it's been a while since you've played Soul Reaver then, or have never played it at all, it's a great time to revisit the world of Raziel and Kain. And perhaps someday, if we're lucky enough, Square-Enix will revisit the series and actually finish it. Despite numerous cancelled projects, the potential is still there.
And with that, we've reached the end of yet another episode. Be sure to let me know if you enjoyed the guest appearance this time though. If so, perhaps others can join me in the future for new episodes. Also, I've recorded a short podcast with the creator of TheLostWorlds.net, Ben Lincoln. His website is dedicated to research surrounding the Legacy of Kain series and helped provide some of the information I used in writing this episode. Anyways, that's all for now. If you did enjoy this episode, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. And until next time, stay retro.